today on the Tearsheet Podcast.
I think some of the biggest areas of disruption in the financial services space is going to be in the wealth management area. I think any service, function in the economy is largely at risk right now, especially like accounting, legal services. They're so expensive, especially for small businesses. And 99% of the things that they do are highly templatized. Sure, there's going to be that 1% where if someone's selling their company, they're not going to want an AI lawyer, right? Or if they make millions and millions of dollars, they're not going to want an AI accountant.
Welcome to the Tearsheet Podcast. I'm your host, Zach Miller, Tearsheet's editor-in-chief. Today we're going to be talking about navigating the financial landscape, predictions and insights with Matt Britton. Matt Britton is America's leading expert on the millennial generation, having consulted for over half of the Fortune 500 over the past 2 decades. He's the founder and CEO of Suzy and the host of the Speed of Culture podcast. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks, Zach. Great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And the fact that you've spoken so much about the millennial generations is close to my heart because this is something we've done a lot over the past 2 years. But let's zoom out a little bit. What are some of the current consumer financial habits that you're observing, and how do they compare to what's happened historically?
Well, the financial markets in the last 5 years have been really topsy-turvy, if you will. Ever since COVID, it's sort of been a slingshot effect. You might remember when COVID first hit in March and April of 2020, there was talk about this being the next Great Depression, and everyone was sort of hoarding cash and hoarding toilet paper and paper towels and everything. And then the government stepped in with unprecedented fiscal stimulus, arguably too much for too long. And then all of a sudden, consumers felt that they were flush with cash. That combined with the fact that they weren't traveling or spending money at restaurants meant that they were sitting around looking for things to spend money on, which drove up the stock market, meme stocks, cryptocurrency, collectibles, everything else. And then, of course, with too much cash in the system, it created a period of inflation, which we're just arguably coming to the end of, where, tremendous demand for supplies and services combined with supply chain issues overseas drove up the cost of goods. It wasn't too much of an issue for a while because unemployment was at a record low. So at least everybody was gainfully employed. And now we're at a point where we're starting to see unemployment tick up, and we're starting to see consumers really struggling. And to answer your question, what we're seeing now, especially with younger consumers, is credit card debt is at an all-time high. Credit card debt just passed $1 trillion for the first time ever. And savings as a portion of consumers' income is at an all-time low. And the government is seeing it, and the Federal Reserve. And now there's talk in September about interest rates finally coming down. And the question is it going to be a hard landing or not for the consumer? I believe it is. I think the consumer is hurting a lot more than, the media would lead you to believe. And I think went for a little bit of a rough patch. And I think the issue is, going back to the consumer, is it's very hard for consumers to change their spending habits. So when consumers feel like they're flush with cash, they're buying all these things and they're overspending, and they're using buy now, pay later tools like Klarna, right? Where they can, and Affirm, where they can buy things they really can't afford. Right. Yeah. And then what ends up happening is it all comes to roost. And I feel like we're kind of in for a rude awakening in the short term with the consumer and with the economy before we can get through to the other side of this.
Wow, that you paint a very, fragile picture of consumer behavior right now. One of the things that we've been focused on, we're actually just launching a new podcast on this week called Compound Influence, about these influencers and their impact on financial service product and buying. How has the rise of social media influencers, particularly in finance, changed the way consumers make financial decisions?
Well, I would argue that social media has actually been a net negative for consumers relative to their financial health, because it actually pushes consumers to buy things that they can't afford because, they're trying to keep up with the Joneses. Tragically, yeah, or like I'm in Southampton right now, and tragically, a father of 2 girls, passed away, took his own life because his wife was a very famous influencer living a life it turns out they couldn't afford and trying to support this lifestyle. And I think that's obviously the worst case of it. But, in a more lighter examples, you have kids every single day that are looking at sneakers and watches and things that they can't afford on Instagram and trying to keep up. And I think That's obviously for young, impressionable teens and Gen Z. I think it's hard. To answer your question in terms of influencers, I think it takes somebody that needs to want to take the advice for them to get value from it. I think there's a tremendous amount of positive advice that you can find on social media. It used to be back in the day, you could only get financial advice from somebody like Suzy Orman, right? I had somebody named Nicole Lappin, who's a great financial influencer for young people on my podcast. And she's fantastic. And people like her are fantastic in terms of helping people understand all the jargon and understand the power of compound interest and all those things. I think the reality is, though, a lot of young people just aren't ready to take the medicine and take the advice that's put out there. But if they want to seek out that advice, there's no shortage of great influencers on social media, on platforms like TikTok, delivering that advice.
So given all these things, we've got, the rise of influencers, some of which you said is a net negative, but there's really good advice out there for people willing to take it, and the struggling consumer. Where do you see this playing out, given all the economic indicators over the next few years?
I think that our economy and really I'm talking about America right now. I know that you're based in Israel as we do this podcast, and every market around the world obviously has its unique circumstances, both politically and economically, that drive the question that you're asking. I think in America, there's a lot of factors that are kind of coming together at the same time. Obviously, it's an election year, and we don't know what's going to come out of that and what the policies are that are going to come out of that. We talked about what I believe is a pending economic headwinds that are happening with the consumer. You have a more existential risk with commercial real estate that's going to impact bonds and a lot of the markets that trade in that. And then you have AI, which I think is probably going to be the biggest long-term driver of financial and economic change in this country, because there will be a period where it's going to replace a lot of jobs. I run a startup of 300 people, and every day I'm encountering new technologies I think can make us be more efficient. Does that mean that AI is going to replace people at my company? No, but it means that I'm going to need my people at the company to level up and stop doing things that maybe they did 3 or 4 years ago, because those things can be automated. And I think for young people in the short term, it's going to be harder for junior and entry level people to get jobs. And I think that they're going to, I think there's a huge opportunity to reinvent yourself, but not everyone's going to know how to do it right away. And I think that's going to have a major impact on the economy. There's going to be some people that are going to drive enough income that it used to take 100 people to deliver that. And they're going to do it by themselves because they figured it out with AI. And then there's going to be the other 99 people that are going to figure out, what do I do next? Like, where are all those job applications? So I think it's going to be a really, again, topsy-turvy and, as you put it, fragile time, I think, in the next 3 to 5 years before it all shakes out. And I think on the flip side of this, we're going to end up with a way more efficient economy and likely a booming economy coming out of this. But I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
I appreciate that. And I agree with most of what you said, Matt. I'd love to double click on that answer a bit. Are your clients, some of whom are, some of the largest banks in the US, are they aware of the impact of AI? Do you see that they've gotten sort of gospel about that yet?
I think most, especially in the financial service industry, because it's highly regulated and they just move so slow. They are always sort of late to the game, not because there's not innovative people that work there, but just because they're part of a bureaucratic complex that is built to slow down innovative decision making. So I think financial services is going to be, big financial service companies, the big banks, they'll probably be one of the last segments to truly adopt AI. I mean, if you think about it, there are many banks that took 10 years into the digital era to even allow you to bank online, right? But at the same time, there's this whole wide range of fintech startups. And obviously you have the whole crypto space as well, and the payment space that is going to very quickly adopt AI. I think some of the biggest areas of disruption in the financial services space is going to be in the wealth management area. I think any service, function in the economy is largely at risk right now, especially like accounting, legal services. They're so expensive, especially for small businesses, and 99% of the things that they do are highly templatized. Sure, there's going to be that 1% where if someone's selling their company, they're not going to want an AI lawyer, right? Or if they make millions and millions of dollars, they're not going to want an AI accountant. But for 99% of small business owners and even mid-sized business owners, they're going to seek, AI-driven services because it's just cheaper and faster and more efficient. And I think wealth management is an area, especially going back to young people, where most wealth managers are saying the same things, like buy low cost ETF funds and and budget and plan and this and that and buy tax advantage munis and whatever it may be. I think AI is going to do a lot of those things. I used to use a tool called Mint. Are you familiar with Mint?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so it was shut down by Intuit, right? And now I use a tool called Monarch, and I successfully have tracked every expense I've ever made and categorized it since I was 21 years old, because I just have found it really impactful to basically track the way I spend money. Though that's an example of a software. If I were a bank, I would build an AI version of that, which knows how to categorize your finances, knows how to pull insights from it, give it away for free as a loss leader to get people to bank with you. That's one thing that's such a no-brainer because it doesn't exist yet. So those are areas where maybe it's not as regulated because it's not in the actual banking. It's on the reporting of how you spend your money, which could add value in the AI realm.
Awesome. I want to come back to the consumer. You laid out, sort of the changes in the ecosystem and how consumer spending has evolved post-COVID. I'm kind of curious what you think long-term impacts will be from some of these changes.
The changes related to AI?
About consumer spending, about some of the challenges that they face. Yeah.
Well, I think, this generation, we're talking about Gen Z now, which is really the teenage generation, and the next generation coming is Gen Alpha. Gen Z being different because they're the first generation to grow up with the iPhone in the household. Gen Alpha is going to be first generation to grow up with AI, which is really going to be fascinating. But in terms of Gen Z, it's also the first generation that is growing up in a financially worse place than their parents. And that, because their parents are Gen Xers who grew up in a different time, who came out into the economy during the Clinton era when the .com boom was happening. And so these kids have an expectation. I'm sorry?
And we got it all wrong. I admit it. Gen Z, guilty as charged. Yeah.
Right. So, ultimately, I think that there's an expectation and even an entitlement of a lot of young people that they're going to get promoted fast, that they should be able to have a Mercedes, that they should be able to have a nice house. And I think the hard reality has already kind of set in, but I think it's going to set in even more. And I think, there's a lot of talk about mental health issues with Gen Z for good reason. They went through COVID where they were separated from their friends, and obviously all the impacts of social media, that some of which we've talked about, that create mental health issues. I do think that as they get older and they get into the workforce, there's going to be a lot of reality hitting based upon the time they're entering the workforce, given all the factors we just talked about. So I think what are the implications? I think long term, people adjust. But I do think there's kind of a reckoning that needs to happen. And again, I think COVID was such a massive event. It really, reshifted the earth on its axis in so many different ways. Look at us right now. We're doing a podcast in a Zoom-like interface, and it's sort of like a normal thing, but it was a normal thing before COVID. And I think for consumers, it really reframed for a while the way they thought that they could live and how everything was easier, and because there was so much money in the system. And now it's kind of the opposite. So I think it's hard to, hopefully that answers your question, but I do think it's just going to be some type of a reckoning. I think, again, we'll be better for it on the other side, but I think it is a process that needs to happen. I
get that. And what's interesting to me is at least today, how different some of Gen Z spending is compared to Gen X, their parents. Decision-making, values about where they put their money. I always find that very fascinating, how each generation. So
elaborate on that. What are some of the areas that you're referring to?
Say spending on oneself, a splurge, right? Maybe YOLO. Feeling tight financially, but going out and buying a $400 bag, right? There's that feeling of sort of comfort in some of those purchases that I don't necessarily know that my generation experienced as well.
Well, I think it's comfort, but it's also, again, I think it's the social media effect. I think many of those people are buying it because they think everyone else has it. And some people are buying it because they want everyone else to know that they have it.
Yes.
And, I think that what we saw pre-COVID was sort of this experience economy starting to burgeon, where people weren't as interested in stuff and they were more interested in experiences. And then during COVID, we really kind of ricocheted back to a era of deep consumerism where, everybody had a TV in every room, including the bathroom in their house, right? I mean, people were buying everything. And that, again, there was low cost financing, et cetera. And I think we're still facing the impacts of it. And then obviously post COVID, we had this revenge travel and everyone was traveling, all of which goes to what you're talking about, which is like YOLO, spend now, live for the moment, et cetera. And that is what's happening. I mean, the expectations that many young kids have to be able to go to Europe before they've graduated from college is completely different than it is now. And I'm sure that my parents, baby boomers, were talking about how crazy it was, the life that I lived. I had a car when I was 17. So with every generation, I think that kind of changes. Again, the difference is, though, that this young generation is in a worse financial position than their parents. And that wasn't the case with Gen Xers versus baby boomers. That is the biggest distinction.
That's a really important point. I want to come back. You spoke, Matt, about finfluencers, financial influencers, but I want to talk about financial literacy in general. It is a topic that we use here. And obviously education, financial education, plays an important role in modeling behaviors. How do you think brands and banks, financial institutions can better educate their consumers, particularly these younger generations?
So I think that it's incumbent on them to do so because, these are their future consumers and it is in their best interest to have consumers that are on sound financial footing. I think if they're going to educate consumers, they need to do so in the form factor that they are easily and most likely to consume, meaning they have to build for the flick, meaning they have to partner with influencers who know how to create content for platforms like TikTok, short form video, fast cuts, get one point across, don't use too much jargon, speak in their language, educate them in the way that they like to be entertained. And I think edutainment, as they call it, I think that's what banks need to do, use gamification. And that's where the idea I had earlier in terms of like create an app that makes it easy and fun for people to be able to track where they're spending, leveraging AI so they don't have to put too much input, but they can get all the output and insights in terms of, if you, instead of buying Starbucks for the last 3 months, bought Starbucks stock, you'd have this much money, like things like that. That will really help them understand how their lifestyle and spending choices impact their financial future. And that's what I would be investing if I was running a bank.
I like that. And given the fact, let's let you run a bank. Do you see the role of banking and banks as institutions evolving in this new era as well?
I mean, I think banks need to evolve, but the problem is that a lot of big banks, it's hard for them to evolve. They're large companies. They have a lot of regulatory hurdles, and the young consumer is only a portion of their overall income. So that's why you see upstarts like Chime, for example.
Right.
Exactly. So then you have companies like Chime, which are built for young people and the underbanked. And, those companies, Ally Financial, there's a lot of, it's a company called Current, a lot of new upstart banks that also aren't saddled by legacy systems and legacy real estate. So if you think about a lot of the big banks, they have banking service centers in major cities everywhere. And that was built for an era where you'd be walking down Main Street and say, oh, let me stop in and talk to my banker to get a mortgage. That's not how people bank anymore. Right. So, will there be physical banking locations in 5 to 10 years? I don't see why there would be. I question if there'll even be ATMs or cash in 5 to 10 years. Why does cash even exist? It's such a legacy system. I do think that we're going to look back probably 10 to 15 years and say, remember when we actually had cash? It may exist, but it'll be a very unique sort of exotic thing for people to need cash because everything will just be tapped in electronic and used on your phone. And the government doesn't like cash. What people right. think is that the government likes cash. They don't. The government likes things that they can track. To make sure that people pay taxes. So cash is not a good thing for the government, despite what people believe.
I want to come back to AI, and you mentioned personal financial management as one use for AI, but I kind of want to look at it as a set of technologies and kind of get a feel to hear from you how you see AI transforming the financial services industry in the next few years. How do you see it like overall?
I mean, I think when you talk about services, the financial services, then I think the services aspect, anything that's consultative, I think it's the first place AI is going to go. So if you have a mortgage broker, if you have a wealth manager, if you have an accountant, those are areas I think AI is just built to be able to disrupt. If you think about accounting, for example, who's going to be a better accountant for you? An AI agent that knows every single line of code of every single tax law in every state instantly, or a human being who's relying on happenstance and what they know, right? Who's going to optimize your tax returns better? Obviously the AI agent, right? And arguably can already do it today, but if it can do it today, 9 out of 10, it'll be able to do it 15 out of 10 in a year from now. So, and I think that's the case for most financial oriented services
to humans as well.
Yeah. And that's where it's going to be at the beginning. It'll be that way in the beginning for sure. And I think, again, there's going to be edge use cases. Just like I often use the analogy of photography. Like there are still areas where you're going to hire a professional photographer, but 99.99% of all photos are taken on phones right now. Right. And I think that's probably going to be the case in financial services based upon what AI can do. So then it over time, as AI gets more and more powerful, it begs the question, what do you really need a bank for? How do they actually provide value besides storing your money? And now with, decentralization and the blockchain, et cetera, I think banks over time, and again, this is going to happen very slowly because of regulation, but definitely have an existential risk long-term ahead of them, because just in terms of the value, if you don't need an ATM, if you don't need consultative services, I never really thought about this until you asked it. If you don't need a physical banking location that you can stop into, right? Then actually why you need a bank except to store the money that you have, right? And then, then there's all these other emerging kind of blockchain based technologies that have new currencies. And that could be ultimately what makes consumers realize, maybe, and I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist at all. I'm kind of lukewarm on crypto, but I certainly see the long-term value over time. And I think I just made the case for it just now in terms of why Bitcoin could be something that more and more consumers gravitate towards.
Totally agree. One of the things I want to, as you're talking, I'm trying to process. You talked about two different parts of consumers. One that consumers are actually reporting that things are still kind of good, but yet they also talk about feeling very stressed out about their finances. So that dichotomy, how can brands, how can banks, financial institutions help address that with their customers?
To deliver what? I'm sorry, you cut out for a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. So as you described a customer, people are still reporting that things are pretty good financially, yet they also report high stress levels. And I'm wondering how institutions can help address that with their customers. Yeah,
I don't know if that's a job of a financial institution, frankly, is to address stress of a consumer. I think there's if I were a bank, I'd want to make sure that consumers can pay their interest payments, but I don't know if you want to educate them and you want to put them in a position where, they're not overspending. I think the best way for banks to address stress is not extend too much credit. Right. And be more stringent on issuing credit, because, you show me the person that's in financial hardship and I'll show you that they're in debt, that they basically, are spending money that's not theirs. So the best way, but a lot of times banks don't want to do that, especially frankly in a higher interest rate environment, because their spread on the yield is so much higher. When interest rates are high and they're 7%, if they have a 10% spread, that's 0.7% that they're making on a dollar. If it's a 1% interest rate, it's 10%, it's only 0.1%. So banks make more money in higher interest rate environments. So it's kind of counterintuitive, because that's when they kind of most want to lend. And there's usually lower demand because consumers know the interest rates are high. We see that in the mortgage space right
now. You mentioned the GameStop trend that happened during COVID.
Yeah.
But we've also seen just a general surge in retail investing among younger consumers. I'm wondering how you envision that as like sort of the risks and benefits, because when I hear YOLO trading, like that just scares me as a Gen X person.
Yeah. It's just another form of gambling. You look at FanDuel and DraftKings, and people who want to save long-term are not trading meme stocks and they're not day trading. They're giving their money. They're either buying a low cost ETF and forgetting about it. They say the best investor is one that's dead because they're not trading. And, I think that the people who are every day, you look at Robinhood, it's an incredible tool, but it looks like a video game. And people who are on it every day are not making money. They might make money one day and are losing the next, just like somebody who is betting on sports. As a long time losing sports bettor with very minimal bets, I can tell you that everybody loses, right? You'll have good days and bad days, but it's consumption. You do it for fun. And I know I'm doing it for fun. I know I'm never going to make money from it. It's just fun. I think if you are treating trading, retail investing the same way, fine. If you're doing it as a way to make money, you aren't going to. That you do not have an advantage as a retail investor. You are on the outside looking in, and everything you think is going to happen, the opposite's going to happen. Think about what happened while we're taping this. Yesterday, the stock market crashed. The business day before, it was announced that the interest rates are finally going to come down. Conventional wisdom would think that when interest rates come down, the market's going to go up. But what happened when interest rates went down? The market went down because the people figured out, that actually signals we might go into a recession. But the retail investor wouldn't think of it that way, right? And so what happened? If they put money in on Friday, on Monday, they would have lost 15% of their money. And it's a perfect example. So I don't think retail investing is a good thing unless you're doing it A, for consumption, or B, with a tiny amount just to get educated. Otherwise, just put it in a low-cost ETF and forget about it is the best sort of way, or just buy a bond or something where you're not playing around with it.
Gotcha. Buy now, pay later. You sort of took a pot shot at it, or at least a use case for it. What do you make of the rise of buy now, pay later? Because it seems like that's sort of a juggernaut. And what kind of impact do you think that'll have on consumer debt longer term?
Oh, it's going to have a huge impact. There's definitely going to be defaults in that space for sure. I think it's just so tempting for consumers to say, if instead of buying one pair of jeans for $100, I can buy 5. And, I'm shopping at Urban Outfitters. I'm going to buy 5 pairs for the same outlay today than if I bought one. And I'll worry about that monthly bill that's going to come for the next 24 months. I'll worry about that next month. Right. And then you make those decisions over and over again. And one day you wake up and you find out that you're working for the bank because you want to feel good that day, going back to kind of YOLO. I think that buy now, pay later it kind of pounces on the YOLO mentality for younger consumers. And that's why you saw a company like Peloton. They did so well. Nobody's outlaid $3,000 for a Peloton in 2020. At one point, a firm, I think it was 70% of their revenues was Peloton because they just financed everyone to get a Peloton and everyone else had it. So they bought it. And a lot of people are still paying that off today, right? And so to answer your question, I think it's going to be a net negative for consumers. In a lot of ways, it's even more predatory than credit cards are because at least credit cards isn't connected with a purchase at that time. There's more steps involved. Like you have to sign up for a credit card and then go buy something. It's closer to like a store branded credit card, but even that you have to kind of stop and fill something out. This is just kind of like you check a box and all of a sudden there you go, you're in this debt. So I don't know how long these companies are going to last. And listen, ultimately it's up to the consumer to make the decision or not. But a lot of younger consumers disproportionately and people who can't afford it are the ones making these decisions. And I think ultimately throughout history, we've seen that debt is never a good thing for consumers. It just isn't. And ultimately, this is just putting more debt on the consumers. And I don't know how that can ever be a good thing.
It's kind of a challenge, especially for an economy that's sort of predicated on growth.
100%. And that's what happened. You saw a lot of companies, Peloton included, and we all know what happened with that company, right? It's like a lot of companies just built their business model on the fact that consumers were spending money they couldn't afford on their products. Right. And they book the revenue when they report their quarterly earnings. It's not like they reported, the consumers that bought these products actually didn't pay cash at that time. It's being financed by something else. That would be an important data point to evaluate what is the real demand for that product.
Definitely.
Right. And that's why you see growth slowing down for a lot of consumer retail and consumer products companies is that when in a zero interest rate environment, people are buying things they can't afford. And now, not so much. And also the buy now, pay later companies are starting to tighten up their credit restrictions as well, because they've had a lot of write downs. So it's not everybody can get credit. And if you do, it's much less, of a credit basket when you make those purchases.
So Matt, given all of the hurdles you've talked about and some of the potential areas of growth for financial institutions and brands serving customers in the space, what do you see as the biggest financial challenge facing customers in the next, say, 5 years?
Well, I think it's really everything that we've talked about. It's balancing the now and the long term. It's balancing consumers, especially younger consumers. They say when you're young, you don't have money and you have a lot of time. And when you're older, you have money, but you don't have a lot of time, right? And I get that. I think younger consumers, when you're young, when you're healthy, you want to explore and you want to travel and you want to enjoy the finer things in life. And I think balancing that for younger consumers, especially with all the temptations like that we've talked about with buy now, pay later and easy access to credit, with living a life where you're, and now especially these younger consumers, Gen Z, they're going to live much longer than their parents have, right? With all the advancements in healthcare. So I think they need to be looking at a horizon where they're going to be working, unless they want to be working till they're 80, right? That they need to figure out how they can save more and how they can enjoy the benefits of compound interest in those things. And it's harder and harder to do in an Instagram fueled world, where credit is readily accessible. So I think and that's just not just for younger consumers. You see consumers of all ages kind of fall into that trap. It's just the consumers that have mortgages and tuition to pay and things of that nature probably are less likely to do it because they have more responsibility. But I think that's ultimately the biggest challenge. And I think it's more of a challenge now than it's ever been for the consumer. It's basically just making sure that you're not getting in your own way.
Got it. Before we go, Matt, I do want to hear more about Suzy. Tell us about Suzy, what you guys do, who you work with, what problems you solve. Absolutely.
So Suzy is a market research software platform, which serves many of the largest companies in the world in financial services. We work with companies like Citibank, for example, and these big banks use Suzy to test everything from new products they're going to be rolling out to consumers, identifying new consumer segments, testing advertising, testing messaging. Mm-hmm. And we work with tech companies like Google and Microsoft, and consumer packaged goods companies like Procter & Gamble and Kimberly-Clark. And essentially, we are disrupting the world of market research. Market research for years has been very slow and ineffective. And now more than ever, especially given all the changes we spoke about today, it's incumbent on brands to have their finger on the pulse of where the consumer is headed, and what they're thinking and feeling. And Suzy unlocks that for brands to allow them to put the consumer at the center of every business decision that they make.
What prompted you to found? What's the genesis story? Why find a company in this space?
Great question. I'll try to give you the short version because it was been a long and windy road. I started an ad agency over 20 years ago called MRY, which helped large brands target teens and college students. One of the service offerings we had was this nationwide student rep platform where companies can tap into college student ambassadors. We had built a software to manage and measure those student reps, and that software got a lot of interest from third parties. So I spun it out as its own company. And then I went on to sell my agency. And after I left the company that bought my agency, the board asked me to rejoin this software company. And after a lot of twists and turns and identifying opportunities, I decided to pivot into the market research space. And that's where Suzy was born. So nothing is ever like up and to the right. Everything in the entrepreneur world is always a long and windy road. And it's just about having perseverance and one day understanding you're going to find an opportunity that makes sense. And that's exactly what we did, Suzy.
That's a great story. And I think that applies to a lot of the conversations we had about consumers as well in our conversation.
Sure does.
And Matt, your passion for what you do and how you serve your clients and how you think about the economy shines through. Thanks for joining us on the Tearsheet Podcast today.
Thank you. It's been great being on the pod, and I can't wait to hear how the episode comes out.